Title of this talk is What a Difference a Day Makes. If you know something about Planet, you probably have a sense what I'm talking about, but I actually want to talk to you about a day that made a difference to me. And it was in late January of 1986. It was a cold day, and that was the day that the Challenger disintegrated on its flight to orbit. Krista McAuliffe, along with 6 of her compatriots, were killed in that mission. It affected a lot of young people in the United States because we were watching it in school, and it affected me a little bit more because my mother, who's recently retired, is a school teacher. And in 1986, she was almost exactly the same age as Krista McAuliffe is today. That's me on the right, my brother Andy on the left. My mom was working at a place called Storybook Gardens. You can see actually there in the bottom it says 1986. And she had recently been laid off from a public school teaching job. And so she went to this preschool to teach, and the deal was she'd work for $5 an hour as long as Andy and I could go for free. And it was around this time that, although I don't remember the accident live, I remember my mother and her colleagues weeping and totally distraught that this person who'd been handpicked from the nation of 10,000 people had lost her life. And it changed how I think about science. It changed how I think about exploration. And it also led me into thinking about science as a career. And it's important to think about how inspiration drives people not necessarily to go into space, but to learn about science and become scientists and do scientific things. And I was one of those. I actually became a tropical forest ecologist. This is me doing some forest ecology, having quite a bit more hair than I do now. My brother calls me a tree counter in that I enumerate the number of trees. I did quite a bit more than that. I'm not going to labor you with the details, but I did count some trees, and I was very interested in how they emit carbon to the atmosphere when we burn them down. This is one of the causes of climate change, and it's one of the worst things that we're doing to our climate today. But in grad school, I couldn't shake my enthusiasm for space. So my advisor actually had this poster request for the lab. He said, I want some posters in the lab. And so I brought this poster. This is Rockets of the World. There's probably a lot of people in this room that have a copy of this poster somewhere. And Stefan, my advisor, came back and said, Joe, what I was talking about was science posters, you know, posters from conferences with content about ecology. And I said, what? Stefan, this is science at its finest here. This is us going to the stars. And he tolerated this poster for the 6 years of my dissertation and then quietly removed it when I departed. I found something more grandiose, but I kept counting trees. I went to work for a remote sensing organization called the Carnegie Airborne Observatory and found that what it would have taken 8 months for a crew of 12 people to measure in the field, to count in the field, if you will, we could do it in 8 seconds from the air. And although I wasn't in space yet, I was getting closer. I was doing remote sensing, and it was a couple years later that I had a phone call with an organization called Planet. And on this call, I began asking questions about remote sensing, spectral bands, wavelengths, et cetera, and things started going well. Next thing I knew, I had applied for a job. I was interested and headed to Silicon Valley. I was on the phone with the lead recruiter from Planet, and I said, so next week I'm going to actually be in San Francisco, which was total garbage. I had no reason to go to San Francisco, but I promptly bought a plane ticket and went and met the company. One of the things I was most intrigued about was Planet's investment in inspiration, and not just by putting small sats in space, but by putting art on all of our satellites. This art that you see on this particular satellite was drawn by our art director, Forrest Stearns. And he's one of the most inspiring people at the company and works on my team. And so my role was to figure out how to demonstrate the value of Planet's data in the real world. And we started with various types of things, including looking at deforestation, including looking for mining and so forth. And I thought that another thing we could do is bring in more scientists who care about climate change, who care about how we're going to fix the fact that our world is on fire. And so we put out a call, and one of the first people to respond was this guy, Andreas Cobb. He's a glaciologist. He's at the University of Oslo. And he specifically said that he was intrigued by planet's high-frequency observations in order to potentially understand the effects of climate and weather on the motion of glaciers. About a year later, a motion of sorts occurred, and it was pretty spectacular. This is an image, it's a planet image of two glaciers in western Tibet that collapsed. They actually sheared down to their bed and erupted into avalanches, moving at 150 miles per hour. The first of those, it's the top one, happened in July of 2016. It killed 9 people. The second one occurred about 3 months later. And Andy started looking at this along with a huge team of researchers, looking not only in planet data, but also data from the Sentinel program, the Landsat program, Aster images, basically every remote sensing tool that they could get their hands on. And this was one of the smoking gun images that they found. It's a planet image. It's very cloudy. People at Planet might be cringing when they see this broadcast on the internet. The top glacier on the left there is the one that failed first. And this image was taken only 2 days, 48 hours before that collapse. And the sediment pile that you see on top of it is sediment that was carried through the glacier like a sponge because it had been softened by increased rainfall caused by climate change. The second glacier to the lower one there failed a few months later. It was actually the case that looking at this glacier in various imagery, Andy Cobb and his group actually sent warnings to Chinese authorities that they were concerned about the structural integrity of this glacier. Those warnings were received hours after that glacier failed. Luckily, nobody was killed in that case. But they came within a hair's breadth of predicting a potentially fatal disaster. This work was featured recently in the New York Times. Andy's published a major paper on it in Nature Geosciences. And it struck me that here is a scientific investigator who was doing what I was doing, trying to figure out how climate change is damaging our planet. What if we could scale that? So at Planet, I run a program called our Education and Research Program. We have more than 1,500 users. So Andy was just one person. Here's a few of the others. You'll recognize Tanya. She just spoke to you a few minutes ago. And I also want to point out my colleague Chase Brewster on the right there. I'm going to mention something that Chase led at the end here. But this community is doing amazing stuff. They're not just working on glaciers. They're working on machine learning to improve agriculture assessments, to understand how we can make communities in India and the Sahel and the Horn of Africa more resilient in the face of climate change. So this is the last bit. So Chase has taken it upon himself to invest in some potential K-12 programming that Planet might work on in the future. And one of the things he did was host a science fair with a local primary school that is our neighbor. And this featured kids learning about rockets, building model rockets, learning about satellites. And Forrest Stearns, our art director, also led an art session where the kids could develop artwork. And then they voted and they decided to send this panel and one other panel to space. This is a piece of art drawn by an 8-year-old girl named Sydney Liu. And it says, "Dear astronauts, how are you doing and how much longer are you going to be in space? Best luck, Sydney Liu." This panel flew into orbit last fall on a Minotaur C rocket. And it is one of the satellites shown here collecting a single day's worth of images, 1.3 million images of the Earth in a 24-hour period. This is what a difference a day makes. And I just wanted to say, Forrest sent one of my panels into space as well. It was a doodle. I didn't think he was going to send it to space. I'm quite embarrassed about it. If I had it to do over again, it would have said, "Thanks, Krista," or "Thanks, Mom." And thank you.